As we found out earlier, Isis and Osiris were twins, as were Nephthys and Seth, and they were all siblings who came out uh, of their parents, Deb and Nu. And Osiris was the first real king of the gods, the first recognized and long-lived reign of influence. He was a bit of a Renaissance man. In many ways, he was a polymath. He was well versed in agriculture. He loved music. He loved art. He embodied all decent values, human values, you would say, even though he was a god. And he was very interested in welfare of the humans. So therefore, he taught agricultural practice. He was instrumental in stamping out cannibalism. Apparently, cannibalism was quite the thing until Osiris said, "This is not going to work. We're just going to stop with this." And of course, his sister wife, Isis, was incredibly powerful. She was a magician first and foremost. She was a healer, but she tended to be cast as very compassionate and sort of peaceful, always going for the peaceful line. But as we'll see during the story, she could be quite fierce, and she needed to be. And of course, Isis is probably the most long-lived, famous goddess in the world. When you think about it, there's a temple to her here in Ireland. There's still a lot of active Isis worship in the world. And even though the Christians came and sort of pushed the Egyptian belief systems or practices underground and converted everybody, and then the Arabs converted people too, the Muslims converted people, Isis and Isis worship was imported into Rome and beyond. So there's a reason that Isis is so powerful and so popular, and you'll find out why. So Osiris and Isis were the perfect king and queen. There was nothing that they wouldn't do. They worked very hard. They wanted Egypt to be prosperous and beautiful, and for people to have good lives. And they were very good at what they did. Now, one of the things that Osiris did was he invented wine and he invented bread, while Isis had taught people to grind corn and to weave. And so they were their reign and their influence was very important for the development of the culture and the material culture of Egypt. But something happened which put a spanner in the works, and this is that while Isis and Osiris were living it up and being generally praised and loved and very successful, Nephthys and Seth, the other brother and sister, were not doing so well. It turns out that Seth was shooting blanks. Nephthys couldn't get pregnant. So it transpired that whether it was the wine, whether it was by design, or sheer desperation, Nephthys came to Osiris and he mistakenly lay with her, thinking she was Isis. And they knew each other in the flesh. And after that event, whereby something had happened and everybody had had a lot of drink, Osiris decided he was going to take off and go around the world a little bit, the area around Egypt, and to develop connections with people and civilize them, to bring them music and art and so on. And he told he told Nephthys this. So Isis gets up in the morning, and Osiris hadn't come to bed, and she goes downstairs in their beautiful palace. And who's there? Only Nephthys. She said, "It's interesting now, Nephthys. When did you come in?" And Nephthys went, "Oh yeah, I was just leaving." And she said, "Have you seen Osiris?" She said, "I haven't. I think he's gone off touring the world." And Isis was a bit upset about this. She said, "How do you know this?" He just said, "Could you just like hold the kingdom and carry on and keep things ticking along nicely, and he'll be back in a few years." And then she disappeared out the door. It turns out that Nephthys was pregnant. And when Seth found out what had happened, he was so angry he cursed the child. And the child was sent out into the desert, cast away. And that child became Anubis, who will feature later in the story. Okay, so things ticked along as they did. And then Osiris came back. And at this stage, Seth really, really hated his brother. It went from just disliking him because they had such different characters. Seth was all about the warrior, the red, he was a bit of a trickster as well. He liked to mix things up. And so he found it really irritating that Osiris was ever so good and always praised and never stepped over the line. And he was just fed up, and he was not best pleased that Osiris managed to impregnate, obviously, that Osiris was able to get Nephthys pregnant and he wasn't. So the scene was set. And what he did was he decided he'd have a great big old party for his brother, and invited him to this huge party. And there was all the best of wine, the best of everything, great music. He got Osiris a bit jarred. He was a bit heavy-handed with the wine. And then he suggested that there was this fantastic box he had made, which was covered in gold and lined with lapis lazuli. And this was just the most beautiful thing ever, the most beautiful object that had ever been created in Egypt. And he was going to give this as a prize to whoever would fit the box. Now, obviously, he knew exactly who would fit the box because he'd measured, he'd got Osiris's tailor and murdered him in order to get, Osiris's measurements. Anyhow, Osiris very trustingly and obligingly stepped in the box, lay down, fit like a glove. Fantastic. The next thing is there's a lid banged on and lead poured over it, and the box is shoved out the window into the Nile. And Isis wasn't at the party, but she came out later on, and there were people sobbing and crying, and she found out what had happened. So she was beside herself. She screamed. It's said that she screamed so loud and so deeply and with such passion that there was an earthquake, the like of which has never been known in the earth since. Her scream went round the world twice. And then she pulled herself together and said, "Right, I'll go find him." So she went searching for her beloved Osiris, who had been swept along into the Nile and off up into the delta. Now, what happened was the coffin had got snagged in a tree somewhere near Lebanon. And it stuck, and the tree grew around it. And it became encased in cedar, fragrant cedar. And the local king decided that that particular tree would make a fantastic column for his palace. And so he took the whole tree and put it into his palace. Now, in the meantime, Isis had tracked down she tracked down the coffin, knew what it was all, where it was herself, and she asked for her sister Nephthys to help her. And Nephthys, she did not agree with what Seth had done. So she gladly helped her sister. The two of them transformed themselves into ravens. They flew to where the the coffin was lodged in the tree, and by some kind of magic, they managed to free the coffin. And when Isis opened the coffin and she saw her beautiful, beautiful Osiris, she was devastated. Somehow she thought he might have been still alive. He wasn't alive. He was still perfect and beautiful. He still had his golden skin, but he was definitely not alive. And as she was coming to terms with this, she turned around, and who's there? Only Seth with a bunch of his henchmen. And he, the maniacal, evil laugh, ha ha ha. He chops off, he literally goes at Osiris, chops off his head, chops him into 14 parts, and just sends his men to distribute Osiris all over the land of Egypt. Another few years of tracking down his parts. Again, Nephthys is helpful. They decide the two sisters go and they find every single part of Osiris and they reassemble him. And they get everything, bar, unfortunately, they only had 13 parts because the 14th part had been ate by fish. 3 types of fish in the Nile, which Egyptians now would never eat, especially the men. They just don't eat those fish on account of it being the fish that ate Osiris's phallus. So now she has all the bits of Osiris minus his dick, and she's got Anubis at this stage now, who is her nephew, I guess, Nephthys' son by Osiris. And Anubis is very helpful with preparing the body and all the rest. Isis puts Osiris back together, wraps him very carefully in linen. So now he resembles a mummy. And her final act is to fashion a new phallus out of gold. And she breathes life back into Osiris. He's resurrected. He comes alive. And they have some glorious moments when the son is worthy of his father, the mother Isis with Osiris in that brief moment. She conceives a son. And then afterwards, Osiris is exhausted, and Anubis helps him figure out that now that he is in the land of the dead, in the world of the dead, that he, as the good God, as the wise God, has a special role, which is to go into the land of the dead and to be the person who distributes justice. So he's the one who will weigh the heart against the feather and administer the 40 questions. And the souls, that when people die, they can go through this process, and it's Osiris who will judge you. And he'll be a benign judge. Now, Osiris still is able to come back in spiritual form, because what happens next is that now Isis is pregnant, Osiris is gone, and Seth has her on his radar. He's now put himself in as the supreme ruler of Egypt. He's happily pharaohing and doing his worst. He tends to enjoy a bit of chaos. He's not the benign ruler like Osiris, and he is causing ructions. So it turns out Isis was wise enough to go to the very edge of the delta and of the Nile, as far away from Seth as she can, and she gives birth to her son Horus, who is has a raven's head. And there she minds him, but she has to be very careful because Seth is raging. He's just out for blood. He's still very angry. And obviously he wants to stay in power. So he sends he sends henchmen, he sends scorpions, he sends serpents. He does everything he can to kill that child. Now, the child is protected by another god and by his father's spirit who comes and speaks to him, but principally by Isis. Isis, who is she's just got such powerful magic, and she's the healer and she is a protector. So she protects her son and helps him get to the point where he is able to come and challenge his uncle as the rightful ruler of Egypt on account of being the son of Osiris. And so he does. He arrives to challenge Seth. Now the pantheon of gods are assembled, and Horus steps forward and demands that Seth step down and asks for his life as a he wants to make up for what happened to his father. And Seth goes, this kid can't do it. You know, he's just not ready to rule. And the gods have a think and they go, well, you know, maybe let's see what he's got. All except Re, who's actually the sun god. And Re has kind of like a thing going on with Seth. So he's not fully on board. Anyhow, they set to it. Now, what happens in this, and there's several different stories, but the first thing is that Seth tries to rape Horus. He's unsuccessful. They set to a huge fight. Seth turns himself into a boar, and he gouges out Horus's eye, which is lost. The eye of Horus is the moon, which is a big problem. And Horus, suitably enraged, tears one of the testicles of Seth, which is thrown as far away as possible and is linked to desertification. That the barrenness of the desert is linked to this removal of Seth's testicle. Anyhow, eventually they calm down enough to go through a bunch of challenges which the gods put to them. The first is that they transform into lions and they fight it out. It's a dead heat, equal. Neither can gain purchase over the other. Then their bodies blow up and they become hippos. And the challenge is to stay underwater for as long as possible. But Isis decides to have a little go at this, and she comes up under Seth and pushes him up out of the water. Makes him take a breath of air. The gods still say, nah, dead heat. That's not really a competition. And then they set them a task to have a boat race. Now, Seth is a master sailor. Horus, we don't know that much about. But they're supposed to have a race in the Nile in stone boats. Seth gets into his stone boat. Horus makes his own boat of wood, which he paints with grey gypsum to make it look like stone. So he's off, floats down the Nile, way past Seth, who's now sinking, and Seth has to concede that Horus actually won that one, and the gods also concede. So Horus still wants to kill Seth, and he goes for him, but his mother intervenes and says, look, it's won, it's over. There is no point in getting to the point. Why? Vengeance is not going to solve anything. It's going to bring more imbalance. So just cool your jets. But he's so angry, Horus is so angry, that he tries to take the head off Seth. His mother cures it, puts it back on. Everything settles down more or less. And in the long run, Seth is sort of kept on, but not quite. He's deposed, obviously. Horus is the rightful ruler, and he takes over and he restores order and balance, the so-called Mat, and Egypt starts to prosper again. Seth is still active. He is kind of Lord of the Desert as well as being a champion. But he has a huge role to play in protecting the sun. When the sun goes through the dark part, it is Seth who protects the sun god from all kinds of crazy evil chimeras and serpents and so on, and sort of dragons. So that's the end of it, really. That Isis joins with Horus and as the leader and the ruler, and a long, stable, bountiful future for Egypt is created. So that's it, Shunuil.